All right, welcome everyone to the next installment of the UCLA A.UD lecture series. Thank you again to all of the speakers and students for following us online and keeping the vital discourse at the heart of our school thriving in this new format. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katy Barkan, and I'll be introducing our speaker today, as well as moderating an informal Q&A after the lecture. To help facilitate this, we're inviting you all to submit questions via the Q&A box within the webinar. Feel free to post questions as they come to you throughout the talk. You don't have to wait till the end. We will aggregate them and look at them at the end to form the basis of a looser conversation following the lecture. So it is a particular pleasure to introduce you today to a dear friend of mine and a colleague, Ignacio Galan, or as many of us know him, Nacho Galan. Nacho is an architect, historian, and curator based in New York City, where he's the principal of IGG Office for Architecture and is assistant professor at Barnard College at Columbia University. Nacho is a rare and committed hybrid who brings his work as a scholar and as a designer to bear on questions of architecture and politics through an interrogation of ideas of belonging, transience, migration, and circulation more broadly. His work extends our understanding of how architecture, quote, articulates society and expands the way we might consider its many occupations in all senses of the word. Nacho, together with After Belonging Agency, was the chief curator of the Oslo Triennale, entitled After Belonging, a triennale in residence, on residence, and the ways we stay in transit. A subject both prescient and pressing given where we are all at this moment and how we are gathering here now. His curatorial installation work includes Cinecittà Occupata and the Radical Pedagogies exhibition in collaboration with Beatrice Colomina, both at the 2014 Venice Biennale. The work of his office has been awarded several important competitions, including the new Medellín Velodrome, and are part of the permanent collection of the Pompidou. His interest in housing in particular has driven a range of recent projects, which I think we will get to see more of today. I'm excited for that. Nacho studied architecture at the ETSA in Madrid, TU Delft, and the GSD, and completed his PhD at Princeton University. He was also a fellow of the Spanish Academy in Rome. Nacho's writings have been published widely, and he's currently working on a book manuscript provisionally entitled The Chair and the Nation. I cannot think of a better person to listen to today, as the space between these two extremes has collapsed more than any of us could have imagined. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Nacho.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen. Good. Thanks so much first to Chair Heather Roberts and the Architecture Department at UCLA for the invitation and for the commitment to keeping public events active in these difficult times. And thanks, Katy, for such a generous introduction. It's inevitable to feel a certain sense of displacement talking here alone in this room. I don't hear any feedback, so it's very weird if you laugh at some point. I won't hear it. So it's a very strange situation. It would be nice to be in LA. Though these days I feel I also want to be at the same time in Spain, where I grew up, or in Italy, where I've spent long periods for my research, but also here in New York, where I've been living and working for the last decade. The three locations having been severely hit by the current pandemic. I not only feel displaced, but also misplaced, again, alone in this room. The usually bustling Broadway Avenue here to my right barely has any traffic today. I imagine it's also strange for you to connect from separate interiors around the world. So here we are, all missed or displaced, many having moved to different countries in the middle of the semester, trying to find new ways of being together in different ways. And I start with these reflections because it is the way in which architecture mediates these experiences of displacement and the pursuit of belonging in the definition of our spaces of residence that has concerned my work in the last years, a pursuit for new ways of being together, characteristic of a life in transit. I'm particularly interested in new attachments for which Paolo Virno has introduced the expression belonging as such, new forms of association which are not predicated on shared essences or property relations. I understand architecture as a condition of possibility for these new ways of being in common with their distributional bodies, their regimes of visibility and appearance, and their corresponding performances. This pursuit requires grounding architecture practice in a reflection about history. And in fact, I work as a historian, a curator, and as a designer, as Katy mentioned, and have approached these concerns through the different modes of inquiry that each of these types of practice privileges. So I'll structure my presentation through a sequence of 6 historical, curatorial, and design projects, developing some threads that will hopefully allow us to discuss at the end new ways of belonging and new forms of residence for the near future, if we can gain certain perspective through this difficult time. I'm going to take you to different locations in this lecture, but I'll start by bringing you here to New York, although back to the late 19th century, since it is in that context that I found the question that gives the title to my talk, who is my neighbor? Photographer and housing activist Jacob Riis included the question in an 1898 text in which he addressed the forms of belonging characteristic of the Italian community in New York City. This diasporic community and its forms of association were shaped by the relation to the recent processes of Italian unification, which resulted from the articulation of a number of diverse territories and populations congregated under a new nationalist impetus. Significantly, the reality of the nation preceded the existence of a unified population in ways that were encapsulated in a famous dictum popularized at the time. We have created Italy, now we have to create the Italians. Architecture was to participate in that specific project, the construction of the Italian citizen, all through the exacerbation of Italian nationalism in the beginning of the 20th century and under the fascist regime in the 1920s and 30s. But the Italian unification was simultaneous to a large diasporic migration that found in New York one of its preferred destinations. And it's important to note that this diaspora constitutes the largest one in modern history to date, reaching up to 14 million Italians leaving the country in 4 decades. In fact, New York became the 4th largest city in number of Italians at the time, and there Italian migrants had to shape their forms of belonging abroad in parallel to their search for an actual home. Significantly, Italian migrants in the city were considered to be not Italians because they've never been Italians, rejected even by their own compatriots, as you can read. At play in these arguments was the rejection of Southern populations in the construction of the Italian model citizen, and this is something that was important both back in Italy as much as it was in America. And it is the possibility to produce Italians and to produce non-citizens that I want to highlight in these arguments. So in this historical project, I'm looking at the Italian community in New York at the turn of the century in order to explore how these processes of citizenship granting are mediated by architecture, considering, for example, the role of floor plans like this, or even earlier ones like this. In fact, my argument is that the social and architectural negotiations of housing design reforms in New York City at the turn of the century were shaped by the arrival of different diasporic communities and saved those communities at the same time. I mentioned before the work of photographer and housing activist Jacob Riis, since he was a protagonist voice of those reforms and simultaneously provided an exceptional chronicle of the transformations I'm studying. And here you have one of his well-known photographs in which he significantly brought to light the living conditions of the New York City tenements, this one particularly of an Italian household. However, something that is many times obliterated is the fact that his well-known discussion of the ways in which the other half lives, his famous book, situated the evolution of the New York City tenements in relation to the different diasporic communities settling in the city, with chapters dedicated to each of them. In fact, Riis significantly considered the tenement typology as the natural environment for the reproduction of specific attitudes, which were deemed characteristic of each of these communities. His analysis linked different problems of the tenements with the ethnicities of these communities, and this applied to Italians as well. And I quote, "In New York, the Italian promptly reproduces conditions of destitution and disorder, which set in the framework of Mediterranean exuberance are the delight of the artist. But in a matter of fact, American community become its danger and reproach. The reproduction is made easier in New York because he, the Italian, finds the material ready to hand in the worst of the slant tenements, in architecture." So while Ruiz became notorious as a housing activist for addressing the spatial-technical problems of the tenements, like lack of ventilation and such, as you can see here, his pursuit was also guided by the goal of normalizing the populations that lived within them, that is, their assimilation through architecture to American practices and ideas, particularly committed as he was to the family as a privileged social formation. By far, he argued, the largest part of crimes are perpetrated by individuals who have lost connection with home life or whose homes have ceased to be sufficiently separate to afford the influences of home and family, end quote. Countering this analysis, and in spite of the difficult conditions in which people were forced to live in the tenements, the expanded households that Ruiz criticized provided Italians alternative networks of support and recognition beyond the family, networks that were fundamental to compensate their virtual lack of citizenship in America. Some have suggested that these increasingly long corridors in the tenements added flexibility to these apartments and facilitated the development of malleable social forms that substituted the family as the main support framework. In fact, Ruiz's attentive analysis recorded the ways in which different communities established themselves in the city to enhance these diverse networks of support. And I quote, "The foreign influx in New York," he said, "distributes itself along certain well-defined lines due to a feeling of dependence upon mutual effort, natural to strangers in a strange land," end quote. His text followed to describe the resulting landscape of interlocking bands of population of different origin. And I quote again, "A map of the city colored to designate nationalities," and he seems to be talking about the map I have in the screen, "would show more stripes than the skin of a zebra." In fact, looking for different forms of support, Italians reached beyond the networks of kin provided within the household, though through other architectures of belonging operating at an urban scale. And many of these manifested in performances that were mediated by religion. Ruiz reported how these performances revealed the internal diversity of Italians in the city, with sections within Little Italy establishing direct correspondences with different Italian regions. And these were rendered visible through the same patrons celebrated in each street. And I quote, "As St. Roch rules Mulberry Street, so Thompson Street seems preempted by St. Anthony of Padua," end quote. Here he was suggesting that each street would celebrate a different saint due to the different origins of its neighbors back in Italy. In fact, living with people from the same location would initially facilitate the articulation of belonging for Italians abroad. However, while religious performances were many times consolidated around these regional demarcations, other times they challenged those divisions and shaped larger social articulations. Particularly important was the Lady of Mont Carmel, based in East Harlem, which defied the atomization of Italian population along different regions and brought all Italians together. The architectures of these performances went on to shape a community of national reach, even while away from that very nation and while gathered around a virgin which had no relevance in Italy. In fact, the Italian-American community was not gathered around the same values that were shaping Italy back in Europe, where the Northern hegemony built different forms of inclusion and exclusion for the Southern populations, but was rather performed through networks of care and support. And the idea that belonging would not be defined around an essentialist project like nationalism is what I want to highlight, especially considering the role of different architectures that gave this community its shape. So while I'm considering these questions as a historian, I'm also asked myself, what would have happened if the technical problems of housing would have been separated from the social project built around the family? Could we consider new architecture supporting social formations, challenging the links between citizenship with the family and the nation? Could we consider housing to cultivate temporary social formations, offering an alternative to those frameworks? So these are questions that I've developed in a housing project in response to a call for proposals by the IBA, and this is a project I developed with the Open Workshop in San Francisco. The call asked to reconcile industrial facilities with housing in the suburban neighborhood of Wilhelmsburg in Hamburg, Germany, and different from the association of the suburbs with single-family home ownership that is prevalent in the US. This neighborhood mixes industrial facilities with the populations lacking stability, including migrants and young people, and currently hosts also a large number of refugees. And it is in part due to the large migration to locations similar to Wilhelmsburg that the notion of residence has become a contentious concept and a disputed context in Germany and in other European locations. The term Heimat, meaning both home and homeland, has channeled many of these discussions in Germany. And according to a local journalist, in the recent regional elections, every party allegedly claimed the term Heimat for themselves. But I'm also interested in scenes like this taking place in this very neighborhood, where Javad Sarempour, an Iranian refugee, is being hosted by an aging family to which he provides care. So the project that we developed speculates on architecture's capacity to grant these different populations with recognition without equating that recognition with property, and aims to facilitate networks of support among these populations reaching beyond the family. To develop this agenda, the project prepares a series of protocols to negotiate a series of participatory processes, including domestic arrangements seeking to facilitate different modes of inhabitation. And you have here different housing configurations, including co-living, and work spaces expanding in complementary productive facilities, hosting different models of collective management, including work cooperatives. So the project proposes a key typological operation to combine these different components by hybridizing the perimeter block, a critical residential type, and the big box architecture of productive facilities. A series of circuits tie the different components of the project together without over-determining their use or their relation with each of them, which would only be defined through their performances. And you can see the circuits in red, and here in the lower part, you see an image of the roof where many of those circuits finish in this sequence of spaces between the rows of housing. The use of timber construction technologies responds to the requirements of both of these types, both of the types combined in the project, and simultaneously links their associated imaginations. A section here where you can see the different components of the project. And in the top, you see these rows of housing I was mentioning that mount over the skylights that let light in some of their productive facilities. So with this operation, the project aims to participate in shaping what I'm suggesting to call diasporic futurities, build forms that are behind new ways of being together, characteristic of life in transit. But while I aim to explore the relation between architecture and diverse social forms, I'm also wary of attempts to establish deterministic relations between the forms of architecture and those of society. And far from any deterministic framework, I'm interested in the way in which spatial relations articulated with specific management systems and performances might trigger material links and collaborations. And I borrow from theories Dana Haraway, a way of conceptualizing the coalition shaped in those collaborations as they are based on affinities and not on identities, thus rejecting any of the implications of the term Heimat. And I insist on the term Heimat since my interest in architecture's participation in processes of citizenship granting follows a historical investigation of architecture's role in the consolidation of communities, bridging the house and the nation, just as the term Heimat does. Looking again back to Italy, in this other historical research project, I'm trying to argue that if nationalism aimed to build Italians, as I mentioned before, then domestic interiors were one of the ways in which that project was developed, particularly throughout the fascist period. In fact, a large impetus at the time aimed to link the furnishing of the house and the shapes of the nation, or as conservative art critic Ugo Jetti had it, to link the chair and the homeland. Following this project, architects negotiated the internal diversity of the nation and the project to quote-unquote beat Italians in relation to the dissolution of national characteristics triggered by modernization and the fascist regime's search for the cohesion of the nation. The term arredamento, which architects used throughout the period to refer to architecture interiors, might be read as an evidence of these negotiations, for it the term interestingly refers both to the furniture item and to the ensemble of elements that furnish an livable space. And it is this tension between distinct parts and the pursuit for a cohesive whole that the figure of arredamento encapsulates, and that interiors helped architects to negotiate, both at the scale of furnishing and at that of the nation. That cohesion was pursued at those two scales at the same time. In fact, the coordination of different pieces of furniture allowed architects to participate in the management and synchronization of Italian society in response to the perceived dissolution of its specificity and its fragmentation. Consider, for example, these drawings of multiple interior distributions of furniture here in Gio Ponti's design process for Abitazione Dimostrativa. And you can see him struggling in these changing organizations that are defined by the furniture pieces themselves, with elements hesitantly sketched in different positions. But not only were those distributions unstable, but its constituted elements were characteristically diverse, featuring different forms, ornamental motifs, and patterns for the upholstery and carpets. More importantly, however, the introductory statement for this project suggested that the interior represented, and I quote, all the postulates and propaganda that I'm doing with Domus and Corriere della Sera. And these were the magazine that he founded in 1928 and the newspaper with which he collaborated since the early 1930s. So per Ponti's arguments, interiors were a manifestation of principle defined for the modes of living of the nation, which he made analogous to the logics of propaganda. In this pursuit of linking interiors to specific modes of living for the nation, film also played a critical role at the time, with furniture pieces regarded as film characters that were in dialogue with inhabitants of the nation. Critic Eduardo Persico, for example, celebrated this famous Mies van der Rohe chair because he said, it is the most similar to us. It resembles our sister dressed for tennis. The us that was identified here was not only the reader of these arguments, but the inhabitant of the Italian house as broadcasted in film, a house that repeatedly included these chairs despite their foreign origin, and you see them here in one film set. Design was not only critical per these arguments in defining the inhabitants of the Italian house, but it was also important to shape its other, in this case, the style liberty and the inhabitants of the provinces, as you can read in these arguments. Those deemed not Italian, not us, following Persico. In fact, Persico understood that film sets could define a so-called Italian interior, as they showed in his words the ways in which Italians live within it. This nation furnishing project reached larger territories beyond the cities and manifested also in projects for tourism, like these houses that you see here. And even beyond, architects hoped to furnish the growing colonial empire with furniture aiming to shape, according to architect Carlo Rava, colonial hierarchies and racial relations. In hoping to give shape and consolidate these different spaces from the Italian house to the spaces of the nation and even those of the empire, designers characteristically brought together fragmentary elements in pursuit of new forms of cohesion. The logics of arredamento allowed architects to mediate the historical ambition to manage the diversity of Italy and simultaneously to furnish its characteristic populations. And it is in this way that architecture participated, in this case, in shaping different forms of binding, stabilization, and belonging that were being contemporaneously built by fascism around the nation. In my work as a designer, I've looked for alternatives to those forms of binding in projects like this house that I developed with Taller de Dos and is currently under construction in Madrid. The project responds to recent trends in suburban houses in the city, all of which aim to reinforce the house as an autonomous space of belonging for the family, which, as you can see, is systematically rooted on traditional Castilian imaginations. And these are all houses in a 2-block radius around the site. The clients for this project are far from interested in those imaginations and have quite an eclectic taste with a collection of furniture from different parts of the world. But more importantly, their domestic relations are far from those predicated around the conventional idea of the family or any notion of rootedness. With their daughters all living abroad and increasing dependencies due to their age, the couple likes to host other friends and regularly needs the support of attendants for extended periods, constituting what could be conceptualized as an expanded family. Making a space for those networks and dependencies, the project transforms the conventional row house suburban type in Spain, which traditionally divides day and night spaces in different floors, by hybridizing a loft-like apartment for the couple in the first floor and a more conventional sequence of segregated rooms and living spaces for their visits and attendants in the second floor. The consolidation of a complete apartment in one open floor plan aims to facilitate the life of the couple that has increasing mobility difficulties. The main floor, as you can see in this section, is punctuated with a sequence of skylights that organize the different spaces and emphasize the feeling of living in a one-floor structure, giving certain independence to this unit. But the living spaces in the center can serve also the expanded community inhabiting the house, as you can see here. And you can see in this model the relation between the skylights and the staggering facade in the second floor. In the cross sections, you can see how the upper floor is constantly receding, and the main floor is covered in blue ceramic with the upper floor in undulated aluminum, disguised as if part of the roof. In fact, the house rejects the more monumental celebrations of suburban living that are common in the area, if you remember the photos I showed before, and instead minimizes its presence with a more compact volume, with the setbacks that characteristically shape the upper floor. The volume aims to maximize the light in the garden, where an alternative ecology can coexist with that of the networks inside the house. The project that counters hegemonic notions of the family as an autonomous and rooted social unity acknowledges the relation of dependency between the inhabitants' bodies and their environment, while it celebrates their expanded, dispersed, and malleable familial networks. These different research and design projects respond to a larger concern with the way in which contemporary spaces of residence are transformed by the growing circulation of people, images, and goods throughout the world, considering how these circulatory processes make attachments to places and collectivities increasingly fleeting. And these are some of the questions addressed in the curatorial project After Belonging, which served as the framework for the 2016 Oslo Architecture Triennale. And I developed this project together with the After Belonging agency, including Maria Otero, Carlos Minguez, Alejandra Navarrete, and Luis Alexander. And our goal in this project was to inspect the ways in which architecture participates in defining our attachments to places and collectivities, and with the objects we own, share, and exchange, our belongings. Contemporary spaces of residence are being transformed by flows of circulation, bringing greater access to ever new commodities and further geographies. But those same circulatory processes also promote growing inequalities for large groups kept in precarious transit. And we were interested in the relevance that some of those questions had at the time of the Triennale celebration, with the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 in the background. We sought to avoid operating under a paradigm of crisis. In fact, the concerns that are obvious in the large architectural deployments of refugee camps and the Syrian diaspora, which is close in number to that of Italians, is a clear representation of the destabilizations that we aim to address. But we didn't want to embrace a superficial problem-solving attitude, as if architecture could alone address these large geopolitical transformations. In fact, we wanted to locate these concerns as part of a large series of structural transformations manifested manifesting in other, more ordinary architecture, some in which neighborliness and citizenship is being negotiated on an ordinary fashion. With its interest, we decided to study some case studies in the Scandinavian region, including examples like this apartment, which is part of a massive program with which the Swedish government set itself to build 1 million residents between 1965 and 1974 in order to alleviate the housing shortages in its cities. These houses were initially thought for Swedish working class families with 1 to 2 kids, families that were migrating from the countryside into the city, but they include now more than 85% of transnational migrants with diverse families and forms of association, which the modernist layouts of these houses needs to accommodate. Outside, the abstract sequence of rationalist facades is now punctuated by an irregular plantation of satellite antennas that bring remote sounds and images of a global domestic landscape. We also looked at architectures specifically purposed for the reception of migrants and refugees, which have arrived in large numbers to Northern Europe in the last decade. Asylum seeker centers like this one in Oslo have a capacity for hundreds of individuals and host kids, single adults, and families. And despite its transitory character, some individuals have stayed in these centers for more than 5 years as they await the resolution of their asylum applications. The shifting populations of the center are an index of current international conflicts and replicate in its few square meters those conflicts, making questions of neighborliness particularly relevant. The Norwegian law establishes, in fact, the mandate to provide shelter to all its inhabitants and defines it as a sparse but safe space. And while these facilities could be operated by NGOs, most are run by private commercial agents who translate the sparseness of shelter into material economies and link the right to housing with the logics of profit. We also consider how the quote-unquote local architectures of the region expanded beyond the Nordic countries, considering examples like Little Oslo, a neighborhood that acts as the Pakistani mirror of Little Karachi. The neighborhood could hardly be characterized as Scandinavian, but it's built with remittances coming from Norway and hosts the desires and aspirations of diasporic communities settling in Oslo. We also consider the role of commercial platforms in articulating contemporary spaces of residence in the region. Consider, for example, the naive version of belonging that is offered and aware of legal difficulties that many have to settle and belong. And yet the operations of this platform are critically intervened by architecture, which here works to enhance a Nordic idea of homeliness through a different design strategy seeking to make tourists, quote unquote, feel at home. And these were some of the examples that help us frame the curatorial framework of the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2016, which we define precisely as an exploration of the ways in which we differently define home today and the conflicts behind contemporary understandings of belonging. The works we privilege as curators address belonging not as a stable bond in the ways that have grounded the essentialist projects of nationalism, but as a contentious affiliation, as one that is being transformed by what different theories have conceptualized as disjunctures, free displacements, or frictions of the contemporary world. The exhibitions that we put together gather a number of projects addressing these concerns, and we organize them in a series of constellations around shared conversations. Some of the pieces feature included OMA's work on home sharing platforms, Design Earth's speculation on the ecopolitical communities of the Pacific Ocean, the constellations by artist Bukra Khalili, and Frida Escobedo's evocative installation of remittances, among many others. This is a plan of the different pieces included in the exhibition. And a second exhibition provided a speculative platform around 10 case studies of residential spaces around the world, with reports commissioned to different professionals, including Architects First Office, dealing with the architectures of temporary storage in New York, or sound artist Emeka Obo, who reported on the techno-religious communities in Lagos. And we could later discuss the exhibition design if anyone is interested. But one of our goals as curators was not only to feature the work of well-known offices, but to sponsor new forms of practice. We did so with a call for intervention strategies that were developed in specific sites. These interventions materialized in different projects ranging from a collective archive, and new forms of representation for asylum seekers, to an app exacerbating the logics of sharing platforms, and demonstrate that the multiple ways in which architects can participate in these questions. We also thought it was important to build platforms for architecture to rethink its engagement in the transformation of belonging we are witnessing today. So for example, we organized the Academy with the Oslo School of Architecture, which brought together students from around the world, or a book including scholarly reflections on the topic. And finally, we also wanted to mobilize architecture's capacity to support specific activist projects. And that was the case of the embassy built by Jonas Stahl with the communities of Rojava in northern Syria, which was located in the Oslo City Hall. And the project referred back to Norway's diplomatic tradition in order to bring together different scholars and activists concerned with the construction of stateless democracies. The audience was fundamentally not architects, but activists and the large Kurdish community of the city. But we thought that architecture played a key role by building this sort of ideological planetarium in conversation with the city hall's murals. And something that is important to highlight before I conclude with this project is that the after belonging was not meant to define a posterior condition, so it's not a post-belonging, but rather the indication of a pursuit. In this case, a pursuit for new ways of being together, responding to a life in transit. And this is a pursuit to which I aim to contribute this time, not through scholarship or design, but by crafting a platform for disciplinary discussion. And I want to finish with a couple of projects that aim to contribute to this pursuit, seeking to craft infrastructures gathering diverse collectivities. This first one was asked to participate in the consolidation of urban relations in Medellín in response to a fragile context in the city. The context, a context resulting from processes of rapid urbanization following the large migration from the countryside into the city as a result of the recent civil war in Colombia. And the project, which won first prize in an architectural competition, aimed to facilitate the appropriation of public spaces in the city, in addition to supporting the strong cycling culture of the country with a new velodrome. So with this goal, the project integrates two seemingly incompatible spatial conditions: the centralized, formally specific character of the sports facility and the continuity of the park in which it is located. So it's organized with a platform in which the velodrome is carved, providing continuity with the park, a facade that folds to open during non-competition periods, and the modular roof structure that is independent from the geometry of the track and dissolves the perimeter of the building into the park. You see here some sections where you can see the platform and those modules on top. A translucent membrane wraps the rooftop together, negotiating the fragmentary geometry of the modules with the continuity of the facade, making evident the tension between the centralized nature of one type and the serial and hierarchical condition of the other. Structurally, the roof is composed of tensegrity modules, with two of them, these bigger ones here, floating over the track and suspended from nearby units that create these triangles of support for the two of them. A series of pieces of urban furniture were introduced after a participatory process to widen the publics gathered by this infrastructure and seek to facilitate the collective appropriation of the building. In fact, I'm interested in architecture's participation in the articulation of communities, not through specific programs or around new symbols like in conventional understandings of public buildings, but through the different kinds of engagement, affections, and performances that the building activates. The project was developed to CD together with Giancarlo Massanti and Fake Industries, though is currently on hold, and it has been on hold for many years. And still, hopefully, development continues to trigger other imaginations as it travels in other forms. And this more recent project, which I developed also with Taller de Dos, followed a similar pursuit. The project consisted on the refurbishment of an old pelota stadium in the center of the city, and aimed to in the city of Madrid, and aimed to expand the uses and publics invited into space in an area lacking public spaces for the quite diverse population that lived there, fundamentally composed of either young individuals or aging families. And our goal was to make the project accessible to those diverse groups by making the old pelota stadium compatible with a diversity of other uses, facilitating the movement around the court with a piece that you see here on the left that would provide universal access to all its levels. Our goal with this band that you can see here was, as I'm saying, to facilitate movement both around and the court, but also to move with wheelchairs or also with baby strollers, so that movement was swifter than it is in the old structure existing now. Those operations that we propose contrast with the entries of other offices, which focus fundamentally on covering the space. And we got second prize, so unfortunately we will not develop this project. But like in other projects I've shown, architecture here operates upon the ways in which buildings might participate in the articulation of alternative social formations and bring diverse inhabitants together. So to conclude, my goal showing this diverse project has been twofold. On the one hand, I aim to illustrate the desire to have architecture participate in different processes of social articulation, particularly considering how those processes relate to the definition of the house and the contemporary spaces of residence within increasingly deterritorialized condition of modern and contemporary societies. And second, I aim to illustrate the ways in which architects might participate in that pursuit to address those questions, ranging from historical research to design projects, or with the articulation of platforms for collective discussion in curatorial projects. And I see the questions that concern me to be enriched both by the rigorous perspective provided by historical scholarship and the critical imagination allowed by design thinking. So I hope that architecture will continue to contribute to define the shapes that our life after this confinement might take. And I hope it will do it by moving away from the relation between home and property that has been intensified by advanced capitalism, and away also from the exacerbated forms of nationalism, which we are sadly witnessing these days. So it's with that goal that I'm gonna end, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nacho. To the audience, please, the Q&A box is open for you to place questions. I don't know to what extent we are unmuting ourselves and kind of jumping in, or if that's even possible within this format. So in the absence of being able to test that out, I think that we really are going to look to the Q&A box as the kind of primary place for questions. So, let me see. Tess is no talking, just submitting. Okay, great. I see some questions are coming in, and maybe I'll just kind of kick off a little bit with, while people are gathering their thoughts. Thank you so much for that beautiful, beautifully articulated lecture. I think, one of the things that strikes me about the way that you think about your work is this way in which you unpack terms, the kind of sensitivity to language. You talked about the kind of essentializing nature of these terms, right? And so I think that that kind of sensitivity to that capacity of language is what kind of really has opened up territories for your project. Words like belonging or neighborliness, occupation, words that really carve out territory outside of the kind of typical citizen agency, user, or other kind of terms. So, I think that you've really articulated on why the importance of that, in your work. But I have a lot of, my questions are a bit in formation, but in particular to this word articulation, which I think is so wonderful. I think it's a productive word in that it kind of helps, let's say, link your modes of practice as well, in that it's both a term for identifying, like you articulate something in identifying it. So there's a kind of way in which your curatorial work and your scholarship have done that. And then there's also a way in which we articulate through making and through the kind of production of architecture. And so I've been kind of trying to figure out what that means, or how that gets instantiated, like how this term articulation like manifests in the work that you're showing. And it's funny that you lost on I had it all formulated as the roof, it's all in the roof. That's where articulation lives. And then of course the last one, you didn't do a roof, but I wonder if you can speak a little bit to this notion of articulation. I think it relates to the questions of ardimento, and this kind of notion of the object and the ensemble. So it's kind of elusive, actually, it seems to me, like where architecture is, or where this articulation happens. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it beautifully, because I think that duality, the kind of identifying, the putting into language, it's an important aspect of articulation, but also this kind of more material or technical way of bringing things together to articulate them is one that interests me, both as a social paradigm that several postmodern sociologists have mobilized, but also as a design problem. And I find in projects like in words like arredamento, that tension, like in that was a design problem. Like, how do we put together all this furniture, some of which we are now buying in department stores, and some which come from our families that used to live in Naples? How do we put them together? That was an actual design problem. But it was also a way for architects to simultaneously talk about how do we put Italy as a whole together. So that's like the social process of articulation and the design problem come together in that word. And I should say, like, that word is older than this period, but it became popularized throughout this time because it was perfect for architects. So architects before were talking about interni, mobile, so furniture, interiors. But at this time, this word was popularized because it was perfect for them to talk about their concern, which was like, how do we bring these things together? So I'm very interested in the term arredamento, but also in articulation, again, as a kind of design and social process that is that are many times related, although not necessarily, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I see that questions are flooding in. So I have more that I want to press you on that. But before I know that we can continue the conversation for many, many hours. But I'll just turn to some of these questions. Because I don't have the wherewithal to kind of know them all and curate them, I'm just going to go in order. So it may be a bit disjointed, but we'll find a way to link them. So the first question, it says, thank you very much for an amazing presentation and projects. And oh, I see. It's going live, okay? Presenting at UCLA during this pandemic times, we all really appreciate that. The drawings and representations, as well as the concepts, truly blew my mind. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about any stance you have on representation.
Yeah. It's not a topic that I've conceptualized too much. And I have to say that I also, and I hope I have made that clear, I collaborate with a lot of people in all these projects. So many of these issues are developing collaboration. So, for example, going back to the question of language as a problem of representation, also, the word belonging came out of hours of conversation with my peers, and that helped articulate a lot of concerns that I had been working before with my dissertation that is now turning into a book project, and with other concerns now, my work on Italian migration in New York. But it was like in that moment, through conversation, that came, like that word seemed to encapsulate many of these concerns very clearly. So I feel like with drawings, it happens the same. Like we are like always in conversation with the teams with which I work in order to develop what are the kinds of kind of visual terms, let's say, that are adequate for. But it's not a topic. I have to acknowledge that I've theorized as much as probably people like Katy or others that you have around at UCLA.
So here comes the next one. Uh-oh, they're scrolling down too fast. Okay. What role does the public space play in shaping questions of belonging?
Yeah.
So to return to that term belonging.
Yeah. I mean, I've tried to show different examples. Like I've been very interested in questions of residence and housing, but I wanted to also show some projects that deal with public space, like the two ones, because it is probably the more conventional way of thinking about belonging through coming together in a space. And one of my concerns is precisely to show that coexistence is negotiated beyond the togetherness of the public space. So it's not happening necessarily only in the squares, because that's probably the more traditional way of understanding it. So if one thinks about the fascist period in Italy, the image of everybody together in front of Casa del Fascio is the one that comes to mind. That's how the nation was formed. Well, I'm saying that the nation was formed through people watching cinema, through people going to the department store, people reading Il Corriere della Sera and learning about how to live, for example. So that's just one example. And I'm, of course, very interested in public space as well. And that's why I showed those examples. But I think that there are ways in which we are negotiating coexistence, both among humans and with others, that are highly mediated by newspapers or by Zoom today. Like, so newspapers talking about fascist Italy and Zoom today. So like a critical understanding of those forms of mediation is very important to not fall into kind of more simplifying ways of understanding togetherness, let's say.
Mm-hmm. I think the kind of next question is a lead on from that one, and it's from the same person, and maybe it links the first question to this. But there's a thread here that maybe needs to be pulled a little bit. The question is kind of, is there an aesthetic to belonging? Is there a kind of visual dimension to belonging? You know, which maybe relates to the question of representation, the question of like the disappearance of the public square, or like where, you know, you speak to the circulation of images, it seems like some of the questions are formulating around that topic. So maybe there's more to be said there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say it's difficult to say there's an aesthetic to belonging, because there are many ways in which we belong and we don't belong together. Like there are many conflicting platforms of belonging. So what I would say is aesthetics do play a role in the way we belong. And that's what I was trying to highlight with that quote that when I'm in an auditorium, people kind of laugh at, like, this is like our sister dressed up for tennis. Like that's like through that chair, like you either belong or don't belong. Like either if you buy that chair, you are one of us. If you like Liberty style, you are not one of us. You are someone from the provinces. And the way in which aesthetics negotiate processes of inclusion and exclusion is critical to the analysis I'm trying to do. But that's different from saying there is an aesthetic to belonging. Like aesthetics do participate in this project, but not in an ontological or stable way. But they do influence the way in which we define those processes of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah. I mean, that leads really into the next question by David Gisson. Nacho, great talk. It moved. A great lecture. Can you talk a bit about your recent writing on the topic of human impairment and disability, and what this work and what does this work mean to you, and how might it inform your practice in the future?
Yeah, so I started doing research on disabilities first, as part of another project I'm working on called Radical Pedagogy, is looking at the way in which the disability community came together to the kind of studio space in Berkeley to act both as consultants, informants, or prospective clients for projects developed fundamentally by Ray Lifchef. And I've been trying to look at disabilities among, like, as another way of understanding diversity and the way in which those exclusions and inclusions are negotiated. I'm very interested in the notion developed by Alison Keffer of what she calls crypt futurities. I put the term diasporic futurities, I use that in my talk, but I really like the way in which she uses the term crypt futurities, because she says that it allows us to imagine that, or it allows us to overcome the presumption of agreement that we all want the same future. And that's fundamental as much to kind of destabilize the kind of rehabilitating impetus of many responses to disability that would hope that disability disappears, that would hope disabled people would become able. So it challenges that by embracing cripness as another alternative and another way of being in the world. But it is this kind of a challenge to the presumption of agreement that we all want the same future that I really think we links this concern that is a recent one to other parts of my work, like trying to, for example, counter the assimilation, the hope for assimilation of migrant populations in different countries, like Rees was doing by trying to make Italians live like Americans in families, in single family homes. That would have been his ideal if everybody could live in single family homes. That's the way in which I'm linking both, like by challenging that presumption of agreement. And I'm just, that's Alison Keffer's words.
Great. I'm looking to see where but I don't read fast enough. I don't know, Nacho, if you want to cruise, you can see these questions as well, right?
I can.
Yeah, are there anyone?
I mean, I prefer you to
okay, I'll just keep going. Okay, so, Morgan, I'm going to kind of group your questions together because I think that they kind of relate, but I can't do it elegantly, so I'm just going to read them. So, having come from Spain, so this is kind of to your own, your own personal history with some of this and how it might relate to the work. So you've moved in many places. How has your notion of belonging kind of evolved? And then I'll just kind of group that with a later question from the same person. And was the discourse of architecture and belonging already emphasized during your studies? Or did you kind of find that, did you invent that, right? And where might have been references to that? Like what's the kind of prehistory of some of this from a kind of both personal and educational?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I would say having moved to the Netherlands, to the US and different locations has made me think about these things personally, but I'm very aware of the difference between the way in which I migrate and the kinds of migrations I'm addressing in my work. Like, I've always been very lucky to have institutions supporting my movement around the world, and like that's critical to understand. That's why when I see Airbnb's motto "belong anywhere," I get mad because I know not everybody can belong everywhere, and that's like. But definitely, my own experience is part of my work, and I did develop this in my studies, particularly in my graduate studies while I was writing my dissertation in Princeton, where I was writing about the Italian nationalism and trying to see how that nationalism was a response also to this dispersion of the population, like a desire to shape something that it was felt was missed at the time. Like it is in a way, another way of for me to address these questions.
This question of institution kind of plays into the next institutions that have kind of shaped you, moved you. This is from Cristobal. Oh, hi, Nacho, fantastic talk. Can you please talk a bit about patronage and collaboration? You've worked within pretty heterodox structures of patronage, biennales, governments, the academy, private clients, etc., and have detected equally complex ones through your research. On the other hand, there is much talk today of the re-articulation of welfare as a centralizing actor to bring resources together, a case few would have made even 5 years ago. Any thoughts on the balances between these forms of patronage, both in terms of your own agency as an architect and in terms of the broader social impact they may offer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. Like, I mean, as you say, Cristobal, like I address these same institutions in my research. So one of the main actors of my book, From the Chair to the Nation, is the Milano Triennale, for example. Another one is Domus. And these are publications, curatorial platforms that are similar to the ones that I now benefit from, and that participate in kind of privilege in certain works versus others. So I'm very aware of those. I mean, I don't know. I've participated also as a curator in some others. So I do, but the connection with the welfare state is a little bit more difficult one. Like, I mean, I'm going to try to read it again. On the other hand, there is much talk today of the rearticulation of welfare as a centralizing actor to bring resources together. So, I mean, I feel like the difference between some of the institutions with which I worked, some of the ones operated by the fascist regime, or the role that welfare can play in kind of providing resources to different forms of cultural production, is what kind of intervention or control there is on the kind of content that is produced, and how do we make sure that different forms of patronage, be them supported by the state or by private entities, facilitate that freedom rather than constrain them, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll save that for the end.
No, if you can, because I don't mind elaborating it.
No, I mean, I just wonder, like, it seems it goes a little bit to my first question as well about the particular kind of elusiveness or like agility or something that has to do with the kind of scale of operation in your work, or like identifying scales of circulation, formats of operation, attitudes about circulation, or something around that, seems to me that it would be interesting to imagine the kind of calibration of those formats to different kind of modes of patronage or something along those lines. That's how I hear the question. I mean, I think you're doing some of that. I don't know if that.
Yeah.
I'm listening to your answer and thinking about that question and imagining what might be or what that points to.
Yeah. I wish Cristobal could.
I know, Cristobal, follow up, okay?
I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but otherwise we will do it after.
I think this format doesn't allow anyone who isn't like in the meeting, Oh, here's Cristobal. Join us. I see something. Do you? Can you unmute? I don't know. We'll take Jimenez's question while Cristobal tries to join. Oh, here, Cristobal, you're here.
Yeah, hi, Nacho.
Hi.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. Okay, I wish you come soon to LA so that we can have actually that drink we talked about. But yeah, so my question was, there seems to be, as Katy was saying, an enormous agility in terms of how you detect certain frameworks, whether they are institutional, they are public, they are private, they are tied to, say, municipalities or governments and so on. the ability I recognize in that kind of agility is to actually link what you want to say with certain frameworks that will allow you to say those things. So that's one thing, which is in a way kind of a complementary comment. But the other thing is, most of that work was within a certain crisis of welfare, at least as many people was theorizing it from here and elsewhere. Europe was seen basically as a collection of relatively stagnant welfares and so on. Now that panorama, if you will, is shifting, is beginning to shift. And especially now with the, of course, the virus. So I wonder, it's kind of a very open question anyway, but what I'm thinking is, do you have any hopes in this new conversation around welfare as a kind of, you know, using your term, as an articulator of resources and forces and interests around infrastructural issues, say? You've worked in some projects that are tied to infrastructure. So yeah, I hope I'm making my comment clear somehow.
Absolutely, I understand it much better now. And I have to say that I grew up in a context where, like, architects made use of the resources of the state to build their kind of more important architectural contributions through public competitions supported by the state. And as you mentioned, when I became an architect, those were non-existent. Although some of my work responds to competitions supported by similar programs like the Velodrome in Medellín or the housing project in Hamburg by the IBA. So those are contexts in which similar kind of initiatives supported by the state were still operating. But I'm also kind of, at the same time that I've used those platforms to develop my work, I'm also critical of the public competitions promoted as one of the primary ways in which, for the last half a century, welfare programs have kind of gathered architects to develop their projects. Because I'm also critical of the way in which more kind of elaborate projects that require more, let's say, ethnographic work or participatory processes are not supported in the same way. So I'm hopeful that there will be a reinvigorated sort of program of architecture supported by welfare programs, but I hope it doesn't come only in the form of public competitions like the ones that have characterized, let's say, the architectures of the welfare state in the 1960s in Europe until today. So, because I think that those limit very much the kind of work that the architect can do. And as you say, like, I like to think of the architect as someone that sure can do a building in response to a public competition, but that there are many other ways, and probably sometimes many more effective ways that require other platforms. So I'm just hoping that if it comes, it doesn't go to those kind of formats only. Does that respond to your question better?
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll tell the audience, I'm gonna go to Jimenez's question. It's the last of our official questions on here. Please feel free to add others or even just responses to the lecture or comments, not in question format. That's great. But Nacho, just going to the last question from Jimenez here. So thank you for the great talk, he says. I often think about the idea of aesthetics as a device for the building of identities. So color, for instance, really allows ideologies to be represented by things like emblems or flags. Even the idea of furniture or knickknacks that we live with sometimes become accessories that construct a politics about the person who owns the stuff. In your work, I wonder if the reading of a rigorously curated but mixed collection of aesthetics is one way of promoting a type of ideological or political diversity. Additionally, I wonder if there is a counterstory or to the story of a Gesamtkunstwerk through another Gesamtkunstwerk. Sorry, what do you think?
Great, thank you, Jimenez, for the question. I do agree that aesthetics participate in building aesthetics, in building identities, but again, that relation is very mediated and is not a direct one. So, but I'm also very interested in the way in which aesthetics relate to material processes and the way in which materialities build identities, let's say. So just to destabilize that operation or that direct relation between aesthetics and identities that has many times been privileged in the analysis of architecture and politics, let's say. So I'm very interested in the role that materiality can play in the middle. So for example, to go back to flags that you mentioned in your response, we did with After Belonging Agency a flag in which what we did, instead of selecting an identity, or sorry, an aesthetic, the aesthetic was resulting from the use of a material that protects from the flag from burning after the famous burning of flags from the European Union during the Brexit. So we wanted the aesthetics and the identity to come from the materiality rather than assume that it was kind of directly linked to, let's say, the European Union. So I'm very interested, and that's just kind of more comical or commentary project rather than an actual one, but I'm very interested in the way in which through material links and networks, identities are forged. So for example, going back to Italians, I was referring to the fact that the Italian American community was shaped as a community, let's say, through the networks of support, right? Material networks of support, rather than necessarily as a kind of as an essentialist project that could be identified with a single aesthetic. In fact, like even the fascist regime didn't have a consistent aesthetic. So it's many times said that modern, like that rationalism provided an image for the fascist regime, but like the fascist regime used every single aesthetic at hand to present its program. So I'm very interested in mediating that relation that, of course, fascinates me by material processes as well.
Yeah, the last question is kind of one that brings us to kind of today, right, or this moment right now. You know, the person who's asking is kind of saying a lot has changed since the Oslo Biennale around questions of migration and belonging. You know, how are you seeing these changes in your work or your thinking? I'll expand that a little bit.
Yeah, actually, sadly, many of the things that concern us, which was the kind of expansion of nationalism, have become even more true. So After Belonging was as much a response to the pursuit for new ways of being together for people that are in transience, as it was the pursuit for an alternative to nationalism, as the kind of more immediate response to those. And we've only seen those grow. So America First, or like all this kind of programs, are based on an understanding of belonging that is exclusionary and that we kind of anticipated back then. So, I mean, a lot has changed, of course, but in a way, many things have come, sadly, even more present since then. And the role that architecture might play, it's an open question, like, and that's why, like, I enjoyed curating that question as an exhibition, because we could have very different strategies that architects are developing to participate in those conversations, many of which continue to be relevant today. But I think that the question of belonging has become increasingly more present with the evolution in the politics of many countries around the world. that's why I was ending my talk with that kind of hope that that idea of linking belonging either with property or with the nation could be destabilized in response both to advanced capitalism and to exacerbated nationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that you've really presented or made a case for a kind of destabilization through a really deep thinking of formats and modes of operation in all of the various work that you do, kind of identifying even the agility to problematize questions of aesthetics and identity, as you answered in that question, to bring them into kind of structures that are maybe less thought or less seen, right? The kind of less visible in a way, and the less bounded. So, for me, that's, while we sit here and stew in all of the ways in which things are looking quite grim, I think that you've like opened up a very hopeful place of operation in our minds together, and in our kind of capacity to maybe think our ways out of these very, bounded places we're in. So thank you. I see there's another question. That was my conclusion. I felt very good about that. But it looks like there's another question. So
I can respond to Seb.
Okay, great.
Because this sounded like good. Sorry, Seb, but we are gonna I think that sounded like a good response.
Okay, well, so at that, I guess I'll leave it at that. Nacho, it's such a treat to have you here. I know personally, just for my students to get to see you and for me to hear your thinking more comprehensively, even though we're not getting to toast afterwards, we'll save it for later, and all of you are welcome to join that drink.
Thank you very much, and thank you again for the department for this kind of impetus to keep public events of some sort happening. So thank you very much.
Great. Bye, everyone.